I'll start with Yann Le Cun, who is back here. This is a space that he knows well. He is a professor at NYU. He is the head of the Facebook laboratory. I don't think we need to introduce him. Everybody knows him. And Madame Frédérique Vidal, who is the Minister of Higher Education, Research and Innovation. The two of you are going to have a very interesting discussion. Now, Facebook has set up one section of its laboratory in Paris. So I'd put a question to both of you. Why has Facebook chosen to set up in France? And why do we think in France, and if it is a good idea, that it's a good idea, and if it is, why do we think it's a good idea to have it here?
Merci.
Thank you for introducing me. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. Why did Facebook open its first lab outside of the United States here in Paris? Well, because of the high level and concentration of talents and brains here in Europe, in France, and here in Paris specifically. The actual process of how Facebook chose the locations of its labs is actually almost always the same, which is first Silicon Valley, which was a logical place. It's where the headquarters of the company was. Then New York. It's actually an ecosystem where there was also a lot of talents, mainly due to the tearing apart of many research laboratories, among which I was a part of, such as IBM, for example. And so it was really a hub of talents and a place where there were many universities. And there was another reason also, which was young people going back to cities, and initiatives taken by the mayor of New York had increased the ecosystem of research and development around data science and the entire department around New York City. So this is why an ecosystem was created in New York, and this led the Facebook leaders to create this lab of artificial intelligence in New York, where I am. And then the next step was to find places where we had this similar kind of phenomenon, a real rise of the local ecosystem. And so where was that in Europe? Mainly two places, London and here in Paris. London would have been the logical place to go to, since Facebook already has big offices there in engineering. But the opportunities were actually bigger here in Paris, mainly due to the fact that there were very little advanced AI research labs in France. So we were the pioneers and the only stakeholders here. And the other reason is the CIF PhDs, which allows us to have PhD students that are also part of the industry. It's such a wonderful opportunity that we're actually trying to reproduce this pattern in the United States. And so there's also a rise here of the local ecosystem with startups, universities, research labs, etc. in Paris. And the more the merrier. So the ecosystem is really what generates an access to talents.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. Now, I'd like to give a first answer, and I'd like to explain why it is so important to attract foreign businesses in France. I'd like to give you a few figures. That's less than 1% of the businesses which are foreign enterprises, although they represent 11% of the jobs and 16% of added value, and 22% in terms of research. So we're trying to attract new ways of conducting business. And we're thinking about businesses playing a very important role in terms of research being conducted within these organizations. So we have a lot to learn, and that is why it's really useful for us to try to meet the challenge. We have to learn a lot from these international businesses in terms of research. How can we attract private sector's contribution in research? So it's really important for us to attract international businesses. And there's this issue of the transfer of knowledge, from research to the development of objects and tools. And now these transfers happen at a much faster than before. So these kind of transfer actually happen within R&D labs. And this is very important for the young generations, for the economic development of the country, and for the startups that are being set up. So we're going to support these initiatives.
So precisely, AI is a sector in which companies are very dynamic and are really doing research. I have a kind of a provocative and almost stupid, silly question to ask you. Why is it necessary to have public research in and this is a question for both of you, in an area where the private sector invests widely? So, Madam Minister, please.
Now, I do know where this question comes from. Now, I'm sure that you're all convinced, but I'm nevertheless going to say it today, because it's always better to say things. There's no innovation without fundamental research, and that is why it is really important to encourage fundamental research, because that's how one day a specific application will emerge from fundamental research. So for me, it's not an issue. We never oppose R&D and transfer and fundamental research. And you probably noticed that everywhere in the world we talk about research, full stop. And we never qualify it. We never say it's an academic research, it's research for transfer purposes or other kinds of research. So obviously it is absolutely essential to support fundamental research. All the more so because higher education is based on training to research, and if we so we have to think about the right curricula. We have to train students to artificial intelligence, and for that we need researchers. We need academic research.
Yeah, and I guess this training aspect is also important for companies. Yes, training is essential. But the scientific question itself of how research works is also important. And in a way, research in AI is research about intelligence, more broadly speaking, not necessarily artificial, but also human intelligence and animal intelligence. So you could see this as sort of a major scientific question of our times. It's physics. How does the universe function? It's biology. What is life? And it's the third major scientific mystery of our time is how does the brain work? What is intelligence? And very often, science tends to follow technology, meaning that thermodynamics, for example, rose after the invention of steam machines and steam engines, and then communication also worked in that same manner, and communication between people and communication between machines. So theory often comes after technology, and science is often inspired by technology itself. And yes, there's also empirical results and data, of course. For a few years now, lots of research in fundamental research on intelligence and AI has been conducted, but it's actually quite a small number of companies. You have Facebook, DeepMinds, the Google headquarters, Microsoft, of course, a little bit IBM, and a few other companies. But as a matter of fact, none of these companies has the monopoly of good ideas. And a large part of innovative great ideas in the AI department actually stems from university or public research, namely in France. So one of the techniques that's very much used for automatic translation, or a group of techniques, were initially proposed by Joshua Bengio at the University of Montreal, him and his team, and then another group of ideas that were based on this one. But these ideas are originally destined to applications and are actually born in universities, not companies. So we in Facebook clearly see the use or the need for public research and cooperation between the industry and public as well as university and academic research. We have a certain number of partnerships, namely with the NRIA, and we find the right ways of making these partnerships possible. We don't have a magic recipe, but we don't see any hindrances, or we don't see why we wouldn't cooperate with academics and write publications and articles with them, and then have an exchange of ideas with interns, with students who are mentored by the industry and as well as by the public sector. And I believe this interaction is very effective.
You're right to underline the fact that when things go well, it's like a virtual circle. And indeed, fundamental research issues can emerge from approaches developed before the theory actually comes out and is developed. And artificial intelligence, that was actually mentioned during the previous discussion. When we talk about artificial intelligence, we're not talking only about technology or maths or computer sciences. Artificial intelligence is really intertwined with other disciplines. We mentioned a few, but there are more. And this is also linked to research in philosophy, sociology. And this is really the strength of public research, because then we not only concentrate on the more technical and technological aspects.
Another thing that's quite important is that sometimes people seem to think that AI is actually a thing now, and that the problem is solved, and that we have machines that can recognize speeches and recognize images, and that there's nothing more to be done. But that's not the case. We don't know how to teach a machine to learn like a human being can or like an animal can. And animals, as my colleague was saying earlier, machines don't understand, don't have any kind of common sense. They have less common sense than cats, for example. I often say that it would be a major victory for me if by the end of my career, which is coming shortly, way too soon in my opinion, if we found a way to conceive a machine that has as much common sense as a cat, physically and mentally. So no, problems aren't solved. We still have essential fundamental things to solve. Certain industrial labs are actually working on these issues. And of course, this requires lots of fundamental research, which is undertaken better in public sectors and academic sectors. Good. So you both agree on the need for basic fundamental research. But what you seem to be saying is that when things work, it's a virtuous circle, right? So in the context of France, let's look at France and the situation here. The report that Cédric published and his colleagues showed that we are at the early stages. And so what should be done right now? What are the means that should be developed to promote the attractiveness of our system on all levels? Frédérique Vidal?
So in order to favor this virtual circle, the government is precisely working on it. And I work particularly with Bruno Le Maire, the Ministry for Economy. I think that we should stop opposing scientific careers in the public sector to scientific careers in the private sector. What that means is that if there should be links between the two sectors. It should be easier to go from the public sector to the private sector and vice versa. Researchers should be able to take the risk and set up their own businesses or to help the setting up of businesses as experts without having continuously to choose between the two sectors for their own professional development. And I remember that some time ago, I myself had to make that choice. And at the time, when you decided to leave academic circles, you for sure would never be able to go back to the public sector. Nowadays it's possible, but it's not very easy. So we really have to facilitate in order to have a real virtual circle.
First, I'd like to state how much I agree with what you have just said. And as a person who actually went from the industry where I spent a major part of my career, then back to the university, and now I'm actually a member of both. I am in the situation that you're mentioning, although the situation in the United States is a bit different. And this being said, I think that there are structural issues here in France, and to be honest, researchers in the public sector aren't paid well enough. At the university, at the CNRS, at the NRIA, it's true in all these places, specifically for people in their early careers. Apparently, in the report, one of the recommendations is actually, the report by Frédérique Vidal is actually to increase the wages for young researchers. That's a great idea. But another way to solve this problem is actually to share time between the industry and the public sector. Research is always attractive in the public sector, whether it's in the university or in public research, specifically in France. And this attractiveness comes from this idea of intellectual freedom, but there are also incentives in the private sector. So in the startups, for example, you don't do a lot of research, but in major companies, there's lots of fundamental research, and there you have resources that are significant with calculations and interactions with senior colleagues. We can work on similar topics, but in a different manner. But these manners are quite complementary, and it helps in one way to help this fill this gap between wages in the public and private sector. And this gap is so huge that it actually makes research in the public sector much less attractive. And yet it's extremely important for researchers to be able to still be a part of the public sectors, to train the next generation. It's impossible to think that in Facebook we're going to hire all the best French researchers and take them back to Facebook, because that would kill the future of the next generation. We have discussed this with Stéphane Malin more than once. Actually, yesterday we were just discussing this around a discussion with President Macron. This is why, among other things, I stayed at the university. It was a way for me to keep teaching, to have PhD students, and to maintain this relationship with on-the-ground research, because what I do at Facebook is a bit more operational and a bit less on the ground. And so this duality is extremely important. Lots of people would really enjoy being able to spend their times halfway between the private and the public sectors.
Well, this is precisely what we're thinking about. And there was a first breakthrough, which is called the Allègre law, which actually defines the way collaboration between the private sector and the public sector can actually be developed. But I think that, first of all, if we really want to facilitate the professional development of researchers, we first and foremost have to facilitate dual careers. And you also mentioned something else which is essential. We have to keep trainers. We have to make sure that researchers can train future researchers. Otherwise, we won't have any in the future. So we're thinking about setting up a system in which the wanting to learn, that really we really have to put at the heart of the system the fact that we want to learn, that students want to learn, to acquire new knowledge. And a few minutes ago, you talked about this specific system for PhD students. Indeed, these PhD students can work on a specific topic with business, and that is very important. And in businesses where there is an R&D activity, it is sometimes possible to pay researchers for them to work in labs, for them to acquire new knowledge. And I think that all this has to be facilitated, and easier to be implemented. And so those who want to do it can do it easily, which means that we really have to think about what we mean by a scientific career. What is it? And that includes training researchers, and how can we value more all the time and effort they invest in training future generations, and what about wages too? This is a huge project, but we're really determined.
Yes, in the United States, in Facebook research, we have 7 or 8 members of the lab who are actually also in teaching positions in American or Canadian universities and have a 80-20% ratio, or sometimes 50-50 ratio, meaning that they do a semester in Facebook and the other in their university. Most of the times they have agreements between their university and the companies, and the universities are actually very close to the company headquarters, so it's very easy with McGill in Montreal, with Berkeley in California, which is quite close to the Menlo Park lab, but the headquarters of Facebook. And other universities as well have these types of agreement, but where things are a bit more complicated logistically speaking. It's something that we would love to have here in France, so that really this relationship could be established, as you were talking about. It would really provide researchers, young French researchers, as well as the older generation of researchers, to really have a career opportunity like never before. There is no tradition of information science here in France. There is no history of having a researcher career in the industry, or if there is such a history, it's very rare. The idea in France is generally to be working in a research lab for a few years, and then to take another position, in a management position somewhere in another sector, another department of the company. In France, in French companies, people tend to believe that your career has failed if you remain in the lab. That's not how it works in Facebook, for example. Lots of high-tech companies offer long-lasting careers in the research departments, and you don't need to become a manager to leave the lab to have a successful career. So that's very important. It's starting to arrive in France. It's quite new. And it's been true for a few decades in the United States and a few companies. It's something that we need to think about, offer these new opportunities to young people in France. I would have loved myself to have such an opportunity in France when I finished my PhD and left the country. Could we consider developing a specific asset in France and Europe around this idea of access to data? Because, as you know, part of AI is based on learning. Learning is based on data. So it's not a trick question for Yann or anything about quality. I'm just asking from an industrial point of view, first of all. What's the type of data, or how can you promote, how can you even make it possible to share a certain number of data sets among members of the industry? And then for research and innovation and startups, how does that work? Well, for Facebook, it's a problem of data used by others and more than by Facebook. But this may come as a surprise to you, but in terms of research, and specifically fundamental research, we actually use public data. So when we're developing new learning methods or other methods, and when we test these methods and try to compare them with the methods that are offered by our colleagues, either in universities or other companies, we have to test them with the same data sets as them. So the only data sets that we share are public data sets. And when these data sets don't exist, we actually contribute to creating them. Facebook has, for example, participated in COCO, which is a data set on common object and context. And it's about image recognition, right? So it's a large series of benchmark images. And we contribute in these data sets. Not only we, but others as well. These aren't private images, not private data from Facebook users. It's data that's labeled by everyone, basically. And so for research in AI, generally speaking, we use public data. Now, when it comes to the application of these techniques for online services, of course, then we use internal data that's never shared. There are certain areas where it would be, however, very important to share the data with the researchers, and for which it's very difficult nowadays. Let's take an example. There will probably be lots of changes in healthcare due to AI and the applications of AI in medicine and healthcare. Well, these data are very sensitive, much more than private data on Facebook, for example. So it's very difficult for researchers who are working with these AI techniques to apply these techniques to the data and access the data. And there's a role here that the governments can play, and Cédric's report actually tackles this issue. There's a role to play by the government to access, to make the data available to researchers, and of course, keep monitoring and supervising rights and access to the data. We can see this clearly in the United States, where certain research areas, such as speech recognition, writing recognition, or automatic translation, have really shown significant progress as soon as the government started sharing the data, such as DARPA, for example, or the National Institute of Technology, the LIST for writing recognition, and the DAPA for the Defense Department in the United States. But it was all based on open data that was shared by the government. So it's very important that the government assumes this role. And just so you can have a sense of the positive impact on society of the use of AI in healthcare, it's very, very important. It also applies to other sectors, such as transportation, such as energy consumption, management, and generation. Many issues that are the issues of society for today, and that would see a significant improvement thanks to access to data.
I'd like, first of all, to say here that the research produces a lot of data. And in order to enable the world of researchers continue being really international, it is really important to have open data as much as possible. That's really essential for research. And when we look at what happened for the Higgs boson, and we know that data coming from research activities were extremely useful. And AI was used to develop theories on the Higgs boson. So there is also a tradition in terms of open data. And of course, AI has to be used in order to understand better all the data produced by research. This is absolutely essential. Now, as you said, in some fields, data is sensible. That is why the government pays attention to these issues, and we have a unique system concerning health data. It comes from a very old system. There's quite a lot of data in our health system. And in order to know what we want to do with artificial intelligence in the future, we have, first of all, to think about how we want to use this data, who should have access to it, for what purposes, and how this data can be structured. Because the idea here is not to give data in bulks, in chunks. What would be really useful is to give access to part of this information, depending on the topics being researched, and depending on what they can bring to society, to French society and European society. That's a real challenge that we're following very closely. Well, thank you very much to both of you. I suggest we stop here this discussion. Thank you very much to both of you.